Welcome to Roller Derby Stats for Skaters. My name is Wendy, aka Scar Trek, and if you are a skater or a coach looking for more information about how to interpret the WFTDA stats book, or maybe how to use your stats books to assess performance and improve your game, then you're in the right place. That's what this presentation is going to be about. It's something that I developed several years ago with the help of the head NSO for DC Rollergirls, Diamond Tiara. And while we do go through the WFTDA stats book or the IGRF in a good amount of detail here, this presentation isn't at all affiliated with the WFTDA. I was a charter roller derby skater for many years, and so I looked at a lot of stats books, and I also analyzed and repackaged stats from other teams as a broadcast announcer. So this IGRF spreadsheet is something that I'm pretty familiar with. I've thought a lot about it over the years in terms of my own performance, my team's performance, and analyzing other teams. So I'm retired now from roller derby, but a teammate reached out recently, shout out to Hua Girl, and wanted to get this information from me again. And so I thought I'd get it recorded and posted so that maybe other people can find it as well. And I hope it is useful to you. Let's get into it. So the Interleague Game Reporting Form, or the IGRF, is a big old spreadsheet which is used in a couple of different ways, but the thing to know about it is that it is a calculated stats book, and it is required for all sanctioned games with the WFTDA, but in my experience it's also filled out for most games where there's an NSO crew present. So the spreadsheet's doing a couple of different things. There's work that goes in ahead of time to pre-fill out the skaters and the officials and the details of the game into the sheet. And then some of the sheets are printed out for live tracking by hand during the game. Sometimes now these stats are recorded live during the game straight into a tablet, which is great. But then after the fact, the head NSO is going to enter all of the data that was acquired during the jams of the game and put all of that data into the spreadsheet. And then the result of that is that different tabs are going to pull that data and use it to produce calculated stats that we as skaters can get a lot of insight from. So there are a lot of great resources for how officials should use the stats book. There's a stats book manual with really specific instructions about how to fill in the sheets during the game, how to do the data entry after the fact. But in my experience, I haven't seen a whole lot of resources for teams or for skaters or coaches to utilize this tool. There's a couple of comments in the spreadsheet itself which are helpful, but that is why I wanted to create this resource. And it's worth asking, I think, at this point, what's the point of looking at your stats? What's the point of tracking stats game over game? I think there's a couple of reasons. Anything that is going to put some focus around how you can improve, either individually or as a team, is going to be valuable to you. So looking at stats over time can show you the opportunities that you have to improve, and it can also show your progress over time on particular areas that you're looking to improve in. I think another reason stats are important to review after every single game is because games are very intense. They can get emotional. There can be a lot going on. So having kind of black and white numbers to review a game with can really be helpful to make sure that it's not just memory or feeling that you're going on. It's an actual quantitative assessment of performance in the game. And then lastly, these stats books are important because decisions are going to be made going into the next game about playtime for skaters, about positions a skater might be playing in during the next game. So stats can both help those decisions be made in an informed way, but also they can put some of those decisions into context for a skater who's looking for reasons why they might or might not be utilized in a certain way in a game. So stats are not perfect. They don't tell the whole story of a skater or of a game. They can't capture everything, and that's okay, but they're still a very valuable tool. So let's talk through this timeline once again for the spreadsheet itself. Before the game, your head NSO for the home team or for the tournament is going to be pre-filling out the stats book with your submitted rosters and with the officiating crew and all the details of the event. And usually some of those sheets are going to be printed out for NSOs with the skaters pre-filled for live tracking during the game. And a lot of work goes into, obvious, but a lot of work goes into filling out an IGRF both before, during, and after the game. So it's always important to be grateful to the NSOs who are putting their time in to do this detailed work. Their work makes our analysis possible. So always be gracious and grateful to your non-skating officials. During the game, there's going to be live tracking happening jam by jam on different sheets of the IGRF. After the game, even at halftime, there's going to be checks that happen, and then after the game, checks again among the different officials who are filling out this paperwork. The final score is going to get recorded, and signatures from the team captains are going to be collected. And then after the game, could be a couple of days later, all of the data entry is going to happen. So the hand tracking of stats that happened during the game, if that was the case in this particular game, is going to get digitized back into the IGRF spreadsheet. And that data entry will result in the calculated stats that we as skaters and coaches can start analyzing. So this presentation really starts at that final step when the analysis starts, when you've received the completed stat book and you're ready to look at it and gain some insight from it. So let's talk about the tabs. There are a ton of tabs in the spreadsheet. Maybe you've had the experience as a skater of receiving a stats book from a game, opening the spreadsheet, and just becoming completely overwhelmed by everything that's in it and just not knowing what to look for and look at. And again, that's what we're here to talk through today. The first tab is instructional for the IGRF. The second tab is the game reporting form itself, and it's going to have a big overview of the event. So the venue, the date, the teams, the colors, the final score, the signatures, the officiating crew, the big picture of the event. The next 4 tabs listed in pink here are the actual live tracking sheets. So of course these happen for both teams, for both halves of the game. So there's a lot of sheets here to track the score, the penalties, the lineups, as in who is out on the track in every single jam, and the penalty information. There's also an expulsion and suspension form that is only used when it is needed, relatively rare, and this form isn't used for foul outs. It's really only used for an expulsion or a suspension from a tournament. And then the next 2 tabs, the 2 in yellow here, the game summary and the penalty summary, these are the tabs that we're really going to look at in detail. These are the calculated stat sheets that are going to provide you with a summary of your team's performance in the game, player by player, and then the other team's performance in the game as well. There are many more tabs in the spreadsheet. I really don't look past the penalty summary myself, so these are the 2 that are really going to be where the gold is for you as a skater, and that's what we're going to talk through today. So the game summary. This is a really large tab with a lot of columns on it, a big amount of data, and it's really important when you open it up to know what you're looking at so that you can get the insight that you're looking for from it. And I've created a Google document that kind of explains each column in plain language, and that's also what we're going to talk through in this presentation, but I will pin that kind of quick reference document in the comments of this video so that you can look back at it and remember what each column is telling you. So on the game summary tab, there are both individual stats and team stats. So each skater has their own line of all of these stats. And skaters are always going to be in the IGRF listed by game number order, so the number of your jerseys from 0 to 9. There will be some blanks in the game summary tab, and that would occur if a skater didn't play in the game at all, or they didn't play in a given position in the game. That area of the game stats will be blank for them. And blank cells are different from zeros in these calculated tabs of the spreadsheet. A 0 is only going to appear if it is actually a calculated value. The team stats are also available at the bottom of the game summary, and these team stats are really important for two reasons. Of course, they're a really useful assessment of the team's overall or average result on a given stat in the game. Just like you look at every player's individual stats, you can look at your team's summary stat. And then additionally, this summary row at the very bottom of the game summary tab is also going to be where you're getting the base average that the VTAR calculation is based on. And VTAR is a really important area of the game summary tab. We're going to talk a lot more about it. So if you don't understand what that means yet, hang in there. But it's basically an important way to assess teammates against one another in the same type of game. So this average team performance in the game is the basis of that VTAR calculation. So there are four main sections in the game summary tab. There's a section that covers playtime, so the number of jams skated in each position and the total number of jams as both a number and a percentage of the total jams in the game, so your playtime percentage in the game. There's a section for jammer and pivot stats, which include both points that are being scored, points per jam, but also other important stats related to point scorers, so lead jammer status, no initial pass count, the number of times the star is passed to a pivot, and other stats like that. Then there's a big section. The third section of the game summary is the plus minus section, and it's really just a count of the points for and against the team in every jam, broken out by skater, the skaters who played in those jams. There's also a net calculation. It's usually called total, where you're looking at the plus and the minus combined to get a net value for that particular stat. You can look at these plus minus stats by position being played, or as a defensive line by the pack together. And then lastly, there's VTAR, which stands for the versus team average rating, and that's each player's stats compared to the team's average stats on the same stat. So it is a forced ranking, and we'll talk about that more. But let's start with playtime. This is actually a pretty important section, I think, as a player and for coaches as well. It's pretty straightforward. It's the number of jams where the person jammed, the number of times they played pivot, the number of times they played as a blocker, and then the total of those three, so the total number of jams played, and that same number presented as a percentage of the number of jams in the game. So as a player, I know from experience that playtime can feel very different from game to game. It can also be a real point of frustration when skaters feel underutilized or overutilized in the game, or maybe you feel like your playtime is arbitrary or it's mysterious to you. But ultimately, regardless of how you feel about your playtime after a game, you really want to always kind of temper that by the actual quantitative data that is available to you about how much you skated in the game, both as a count of jams and also as a percentage of the number of jams that happened in the game. So make sure your perceptions are tempered by the reality of the stats here. Team captains and coaches are always going into games with, I shouldn't say always, but usually going into especially competitive games, having made really deliberate choices about how much they intend to play different skaters on the team, in which positions. People are writing lineups and doing a lot of prep work ahead of the game. But everybody knows that games are chaotic. A lot of stuff happens during a game. So it's really useful for the coaching staff as well to look back at this section after the game and see how their lineups shook out. Like, did they actually end up playing people the way that they intended to? And especially, I think it's useful to notice if and when players are underutilized unintentionally by the coaching staff. That can happen. And when that does happen, it's a really great opportunity to just have a conversation with that skater so that they don't have to wonder why they didn't get the playtime that they expected or that was intended. And they don't have to, have a mystery about that. And I know that in general, conversations about playtime can be really tough, and I've seen a lot of them happen. I've been a part of some of those conversations myself. And having these stats, not just for one game, but for multiple games over the season, can really help ground those conversations in, reality. And basically you have real numbers to look at and have a conversation about, as opposed to just the feelings about it or the perceptions about it. I think it can also really help the coaches and the skaters agree about a path forward. So I could imagine a scenario where the coach is saying something like, we intended to play you in a third of the game. We wanted to give you 33% of the playtime, but I see that in the stats you only got 25%. That was unintentional. Let's check in after the next couple of days and next couple of games, and make sure that you are getting, the playtime that we intend to give you. And you can kind of make an agreement about that and then check back in. But one thing to note about this section, games really can have a range in the number of jams that are in them. So some games have a lot of quick call-offs, single pass jams, and then some games have a lot of penalties, power jams, and there are fewer jams in a game like that. So the percentage of playtime in the game, the percent of jams skated, that final column in this section, is the best metric to track over time. It's going to equalize between the different types of games that happen with different numbers of jams. So here's what the game summary tab looks like. And what I've done here is I've blurred out everything that's not this section that we're looking at right now. So we're only looking at the first four or five columns. That's the jams played section, the playtime section. So you can see for this team here, this is kind of just a random stat sheet that I pulled. You can see they have a couple of skaters who didn't skate in any jams. Couple of zeros there. They have a couple of skaters, it looks like 3 skaters that they're utilizing really heavily. So they've got number 10 at 72% of the game is how much that skater skated in the game. They've got 2 players at 69% of the game. Nice. They have a skater at 54%, and then a total range, from there down to 5%. And you can kind of get a sense of how they're utilizing their players, not just by the count of jams, but the percentage of the game that each player skated. The summary percentage down at the bottom is a pretty useful thing to keep an eye on for the coaching staff. Looks like this particular coaching staff is giving an average of 33% of playtime to each player on the team. And this is a pretty typical percentage, I'd say, for the stat sheets that I've seen. If this stat is a lot higher, it usually indicates a much smaller team where nobody is benched. Everyone's playing a lot in the game, so it might sneak up in the 40s or the 50s. I've even seen it in the 60s for a really small team where everyone's pretty much playing the whole game. So next, let's look at the jammer and pivot section of the game summary tab. This is a very important section for jammers, but I want to make the case also that it's a very important section for blockers to look at as well. Let's talk through the columns. So the first one is points scored in the game by the skater. So that one's pretty straightforward. Doesn't account for the points scored against them. It's just the straight positive count of points scored by the jammer in the game. Points per jam takes that above stat, but then divides it by the number of jams where the skater jammed. So it's breaking it down into, on average, if this skater is jamming, how many points will they score? The next couple are a count of various lead jammer status things that you want to keep track of. It's the number of times a jammer loses lead jammer status or loses the ability to become lead jammer, usually from a penalty. It's a count of the number of times that the skater got lead jammer status, the number of times that the skater called off the jam successfully, whether they were or weren't lead jammer. A jam called off in error will still be tallied in this stat. And then a really useful count of how many times the jammer didn't complete their initial trip in a jam. That's a stat that, especially, developing jammers and also offensive players in the pack want to keep an eye on and want to monitor how high this particular stat is so that they can work on offensive plays at the start of the jam to make sure the initial trip is completed on every jam. There's also a count of star passes received by the pivot. And then the next 3 stats here look at the performance of the jammer when they have lead jammer status. So this is a subset of jams where the jammer does have lead jammer status. And if lead was never acquired by a skater, this section will be empty. So the first one is the percentage of jams where they got lead jammer. So their lead jammer percentage. This is a useful stat to track over time and to work on improving, both for the jammer, but also for the offensive skaters in the pack. There's the lead plus minus, where we're tracking and we're going to talk a lot more about plus minus calculations in the next section, but this is basically the points earned by the skater when they had lead minus the points scored by the other team while this jammer had lead jammer status. And we know strategically we shouldn't be giving up points when we have lead jammer status, so this can be an area for coaches to look at and make sure they're not giving away too many points while lead jammer status has been acquired by the team. And then there's the average lead plus minus, which is just the above stat divided by the number of jams where the jammer had lead jammer status, so the number of opportunities for this stat to be collected. And I think as a blocker out in the pack, I think this section is also really useful to look at, because you do want to be aware of, on your own team, which jammer is playing the most, which jammer has the strongest average points per jam, the strongest lead percentage, and that can kind of affect what your plan is going into the jam. It's also really useful to know which jammers on your team have the most trouble with their initial trip, so the no initial trip stat. You want to know who has a high number in that stat game over game, because you want to really focus on helping them at the whistle, but then also if they don't acquire lead jammer status, there's really got to be a concerted effort to get them through the pack so that the jam will get called off instead of being a scoring spree by the other team. So this is useful info for the blockers as well, and you really do want to look at your jammer line and know their stats as well, so that you know how best to help them in the jam. Lastly, this is an area that can be really useful when you're going into a game and you're scouting another team. You can look at this section of past games from that team and see who is their most productive point scorer, see who is having trouble with their initial trip, see who is most likely to get lead jammer status. And for a coaching staff, if you're looking at another team before the game and you're seeing someone with a really high lead percentage, that is the jammer that you want your strongest defensive pack out against in the game. So you can make coaching decisions from this section as well. This is what the section looks like in the game summary tab. So it's the second section. You can see the count of lead, lost lead, call-offs, no initial trip, star passes. You can see everybody's lead percentage there. So looking at this particular team, we have a real standout lead percentage at 78%. So 78% of the jams that this skater went out in, they got lead jammer status. So if I were the other team looking at this team about to play them, I would know that number 27, their jammer, really needs a strong defensive line out against, so that that lead jammer stat can be contained for this jammer. But they have 2 other skaters with pretty good percentages here, 45, there's 25, 20%. So something to be aware of as you're scouting the other team as well. The lead plus minus is just the calculation of points they scored while they were jammer versus points scored against their team while they had lead as a jammer. And then the average plus minus, as we said, is just that same stat, but made into an average by virtue of how many jams they skated in. You can also look at the team summary down at the bottom for some useful info. How many times did the whole team lose lead? What was the lead percentage for the team overall? 38%, it looks like in this case. How much is this team passing the star? Looks like 6 times they did that in this game. So you can get a lot of information from the team summary tab as well. The team summary row on this tab. All right, plus minus. This is a pretty big section. It's kind of intimidating because it's got a lot of numbers in it. And one thing you'll note if you look at stats over time, more than one stat book, you're going to notice that this section really has a lot of variety in it based on what type of game it was. So this area of the game summary tab is always really closely tied to the type of game that it was for your team, whether it was a big win or a big loss or even a tie. In a big win for your team, almost everyone's going to have positive numbers in this section because there was a surplus of points by your team versus the other team. With a big loss, it's going to be the opposite. Almost everyone's going to be negative in this section. And if it's a close tie, you're going to see a lot of numbers close to 0 in this section. I think it's pretty obvious, but it's worth saying here that in this entire section, we're not just talking about points for jammers. We're talking about points for the entire team. So when a player was on the track in any position, the points that they score are plus points for them and for their team, and points that are scored against them while they are on the track, while they're in the jam, are points against their team, and they're counted for every single player, even blockers and pivots. So the total plus minus is that calculation of both things together, so it's the net of the points for and the points against in a given jam. And then each of these gets broken out by position, so jammer, pivot, blocker, and pack. And pack is an area of the stats that's really just putting the pivots and the blockers together so that especially pivots can look at their stats, as a pack rather than breaking them out and having to look at their pivot stats and their blocker stats separately. Of course, the average of each of these is just for each individual skater how many times they played in that position, and creating an average out of that over the jams that they skated in. And then the very bottom one, the average plus minus, is going to combine all the different positions, jammer, pivot, blocker, and give you the average, the total overall plus minus averaged by the number of jams the particular skater skated in. So let's look at this section on the game summary tab, and I think it'll become a little bit more clear. So again, it's a big section, a lot of numbers in it. You can see the straight count of points for each of these skaters while they were playing in the game, and points against these skaters while they were playing in the game. And then there's that total plus minus, this calculated number. If you look at row number 2 there, it's pretty easy math. There were 8 points scored while the skater was on the track. There were 38 points scored against this team while the skater was on the track, so the net is -30. So this is a pretty simple calculation of, the net point scoring that happened while each player was playing, regardless of their position. And you can see pretty quickly here, most of these numbers are negative. All of these calculated numbers are negative. And there's a really easy explanation for why that would be. This team lost this game. They were at a deficit of points. Every single player was at a deficit, and the team itself was at a deficit of points. So they lost this game. But each player is going to get a breakout by position in the columns that follow. And then all the way on the right side of this section, the average plus minus takes that total plus minus and divides it by the number of jams each of these skaters skated in. So again, this is a section that is important, especially because of the bottom line, the bottom row, the team summary is kind of an overview of how the entire team did on these stats, and that is the basis of the next section, the VTAR section. But there was nothing really in this section that I personally looked at regularly because, again, you can't really compare game to game in this particular section. This is a comparison of your performance or your team's performance against the other team, and other teams are always different game to game. So this section is kind of just informing the next section in my mind and in my method of looking at stats. So let's take a look at the next section, the VTAR section. This is a very important tool for roller derby players to assess their performance. And VTAR stands for Versus Team Average Rating. And again, the way to think about this section is this is a way for teammates to compare themselves to the team's average performance in the same game. So it's really equalizing for a big win or a big loss. It doesn't matter what type of game it was. There's always going to be a team summary average performance on these stats, and you're always either going to be above those average stats or below them for your own team in the same game. So it is a forced ranking, and rather than that's my cat. Rather than thinking of it as comparing teammates to each other in this particular section, which is a tempting thing to do, what you really want to do is look at your own stats in this section and compare your own stats game over game. Is your VTAR headed in the right direction, or was it a rough game for you personally? So you always want to compare yourself to yourself and not necessarily to others. That's a good rule of thumb psychologically for roller derby, in my opinion. So let's look at this section in the game summary tab. It's the section all the way over to the right. And you'll notice that there's no summary at the bottom because this is all based on the summary from the prior section. But it does look kind of similar to the last section. There's points for, points against, total plus minus, then there's the broken out by position, and then there's the total VTAR average plus minus. And this is really the holy grail of personal effectiveness stats as a skater. This is the number that you want to look at and track over time. So let's go back and look at what they are. It's points for and against compared to the points for and against average of their own team in the game. The total plus minus compared to the average of the team. And then there's the position breakouts, and then the total VTAR average plus and minus. So the skater's average plus minus in the jams that they skated against the total plus minus average of the team overall. So the nature of the average, you know that when an average is produced, there are always values above it and there are always values below it. That's the nature of creating an average in general, right? So because we've created an average out of one team's performance on each stat, there are always going to be skaters who contributed to the average from above and skaters who contributed to the average from below. So what we're doing is basically making that clear, who's above and who's below average on the same team in the same game. That's why this stat is so useful, and it's something that you can track over time, game over game. Different types of games all yield the same basic, result in the VTAR section. So looking at a couple of these skaters, we've got a pretty big swing going on in the total VTAR plus minus average for this team in this game. We've got something as low as -12, and we've got, it looks like the highest value for this team is 2.88. So that -12 is definitely an outlier in this average. You can kind of tell, and it's because this skater only played in 2 jams. And we'll talk about outliers and skaters who don't play in the game as much in a little bit here. But, some of these skaters are positive with all the ones that you see there, 1 point, 2 point. And then some of the skaters are negative. There's a -3, -0.3, -0.4. So again, this is a forced ranking, again, each player against the team's average performance in the game. All right, so takeaways from this huge game summary tab of the IGRF. There's a section where you're going to be able to track your playtime quantitatively and temper your feelings about your playtime with actual data that has been tracked carefully by NSOs. There is going to be a section where you can track your effectiveness as a jammer or a pivot. There's a section where you can assess your individual and team performance against the opponent. And there's finally a really important section where you can assess your performance against your own teammates in the same game. A couple of ideas that might help you keep your stats in context, because as I said at the top, stats aren't perfect. They don't tell you everything about a skater or about a game. And importantly, past stats aren't going to predict future performance. They can provide a snapshot of a particular game. They can even show a trend over time if you're looking at multiple stat sheets. But every game is different. Every opponent is different. Every skater is different during every game, right? So we can't use them to predict. We can only use them to inform decisions and to direct our efforts at improving as an individual or as a team. Your stats are obviously also going to become more accurate and more valuable to you the more playtime that you get. If you're only in a couple of jams, it's really not an accurate look at how you would perform if you were skating in many more jams, right? So keep in mind as well that there's a lot of luck in the mix here, because even within a game, there's a lot of variety in the types of jams that there are. So these stats aren't really accounting for situations where you have a power jam or the other team has a power jam, or maybe one team has a huge pack advantage in a particular jam. The stats aren't showing that, they're just showing the number of points that were scored against you. So it's not telling the whole story of your strength as a skater necessarily. The mix of jams that you happen to play in will definitely impact your stats in the game. So if you just happen to get some of the ugliest jams in the game, that's going to show up in your stats and impact those. And on that note, something I've noticed over the years is that the players, sometimes they're called the power players or the power pack if your team uses something like that. These highly utilized players are often going to be the ones that are starting in some of these worst case scenario jams where they're at a huge pack advantage, or there's a big power jam with a dangerous jammer from the other team starting on the line. So things like that can also impact stats. So you might be looking at that top blocker on your team and pointing at their stats and saying, look at this though. And you just have to keep in mind, the mix of jams that a skater skates in definitely impacts their stats in that game. So averages, most of these stats are based on averages. Some of the most valuable ones are the averages. And when there is an outlier in the stat sheet, it's usually because they didn't play in very many jams, but the jams that they did play were big in one way or another. Either they were quite bad or they were quite good. And so some of their numbers are way different than everyone else's on the team. That skews the average. And anytime an average is skewed on the team summary tab, that's going to skew everyone's VTAR stats as well, because VTARs are based on the team summary average. So keep that in mind. They're still the official stats, but averages can really be affected by those, outlier stats that usually come from players who don't play much in the game. Another thing we talk about a lot in Derby strategically is points protection, and it's worth noting that in the stats, points are going to be applied equally across everyone who played in the jam, regardless of which skaters are actually passed on the track by the other jammer. So if there's a situation where you are able to protect your point, the jammer doesn't pass you personally in the jam, and perhaps they only score 2 points in that pass, that 2 points is still going to be applied to everyone who was a part of the jams. It would be incredibly difficult to track down to the skater who was passed and who was not, if you think about what NSOs are doing live in the game. So when you protect your point, that's not going to show up in your stats, but it's still obviously very important to do that. And then penalties, it goes without saying that penalties are a big impact on the game. They affect the lineup negatively when people are getting a lot of penalties on our team, and then it's going to give us a huge advantage when there are penalties on the other team. So penalties aren't necessarily, let's say, cross-referenced with the points for and against, but of course they are a huge impact on points for and points against in any particular jam. And penalties, of course, don't just affect the skater penalized, they affect the entire team and the other team. So they definitely have a huge impact, but they're not exactly tracked in the same way. But let's look at how they are tracked. So the next calculated tab in the IJRF is the penalty summary tab. And this really gives you a lot of info. It's a much simpler tab, thankfully, but it does give you a lot of information on what you can do to improve individually and as a team. So the first section is looking at the penalties by individual skaters. And this is presented as a count, and it's also presented as an average. So here is the penalty summary section for the individual skaters on this team in this game. You can see the skaters listed down the left and the penalties listed across in the column, so all the possible penalties there, and a calculated stat of how many times that penalty was recorded for that skater in the game. Then you've got a total number of penalties, the penalty count, And that's something that you want to keep an eye on game over game and watch for yourself as a player. Of course, you want to think about which penalties you're actually getting in the game too, and work on that in practice and in scrimmage. Then we've got this particular tab is pulling in the number of jams skated so that it can provide an average number of penalties per jam. So a couple of skaters we can look at here to get a sense of the story of penalties per jam. We've got number 111, who only skated in 2 jams but got 2 penalties, so that's 100% penalties per jam, unfortunately. Similarly, we've got number 48, about halfway down, also skated in 2 jams but got 0 penalties, so that's a 0% penalties per jam. And then pretty much everything in between. So in general, again, the more jams you skate in, the more valuable and accurate, predictive this data will become. But penalties per jam is an important stat to track for yourself and for your team, along with the actual penalties that you're getting and your count of penalties. The other really important section that is often overlooked in the stats book, I think, is the penalties by team. So that's the bottom row that's adding everything up at the bottom of this particular tab is going to give you great information for your team's development. And what it's telling you is the total of each type of penalty the team is getting in the game. And it's also going to tell you the penalty total for the game overall. So how many total penalties did we rack up as a team? And that's going to be presented as well as a percentage of the game's total penalties across both teams. So you can kind of compare your penalties to the other team's penalties and see what kind of advantage or disadvantage you had in the game. And then it's going to provide those averages, which are useful to compare in different types of games over time. So let's look at this section. It's at the bottom of the penalty summary. So all the skaters are listed up above, but I've cut those out so that we can just focus in on the bottom. We are seeing the total of each type of penalty. So in this particular game, this team had a real problem with multiplayer and direction penalties. Looks like they had 10 each of those. They also had a little trouble with forearms. They had 6 forearms in this game. But the biggest thing that I see for this team is that they totaled 43 penalties in the game. And that is a lot. I think anything over 40 penalties for a team is no good. So in general, we want to have fewer penalties than that in the game. And it really just translates into people on the track to play roller derby, right? It's a maintaining your advantage on the track with your players not in the penalty box. So in this case, 43 penalties accounted for 61% of the game's total penalties. So the other team was at a huge advantage here. You can tell by the percentage. If it were 50-50, then it would be an even split between the two teams, an even disadvantage, let's say, from the penalties that were taken in the game. But this team got 61% of the game's penalties, so you can tell that they were at a huge player disadvantage, and they had a lot of penalties overall, so this was a rough game for them. The average penalties per jam was, it looks like at least one penalty per jam could be expected from this team, which is kind of also no good. And their opponent, comparing that to their opponent, was only 0.37. So you can, again, just see that this team was at a huge disadvantage in this particular game because of their penalties. Another place to look is over at the far right hand side of this, the penalties per jam, which was that average for each player up above. We also have it for the team overall. So 20% penalties per jam average for this team in this game. So any individual player on average would have a 20%, would be getting a penalty in 20% of the jams that they skated in. Now this area of the penalty summary tab also has a good example of something that can sometimes happen in the IGRF stats sheet. I find this happens, I think, even more when I open stat sheets in Google Docs rather than Excel. But you can see that there's a couple of columns here that are not formatted correctly. You can't really see the number that's in the cell. So I wanted to show you how to correct that. Basically, you want to click into the cell itself and reduce the number of decimal places that are showing in the cell so that you can get the number you're actually trying to see. You can also resize the column to show, the full number. But this is a pretty easy way to make sure that you're looking at a number that means something for you, instead of looking at, a bunch of decimals that don't fit into the cell. All right, so big picture overall analysis of the IGRF, what do you want to keep in mind? Because I think the more that you look at stat sheets over time, you will start to kind of intuitively understand what they're telling you. And I think an experience that I had as well was that you could really kind of relive the game in a way through the stats and looking at the stats after the fact. So if you do encounter a situation where something doesn't look right in the stats to you, I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind about a situation like that. First of all, NSOs do a lot of complicated work during the game to track stats, and it is completely understandable that there might be some human error in paperwork. There's a lot happening. There's a lot to track on each of the individual printed sheets, and if you've never actually tracked stats during a game, if you're a player or a coach and you've never done that, I would highly recommend that you do it so that you understand better the data that's going into the IGRF, so that you can understand the data that you're getting back out of it at the end. Something else to keep in mind along the same lines actually is that NSO crews are very frequently understaffed. They might be undertrained as well on the paperwork. So volunteering to get involved in helping with that can really help you understand stats better, but it can also help other players get a chance to look at more accurate stats. But I think human error in general is unavoidable, and it happens, and it, the most important thing is to be understanding, be gracious, be kind about it, and stay curious about it if something doesn't look right. I think the other place an error could occur is in the step where the data is being digitized after the game, like a data entry error. This is, I think, less likely in my experience. The head NSOs who do this work are very experienced at doing it, and they're much more likely to correct a problem on handwritten paperwork than they are to make a new mistake in the data entry step. But you can always reach out to a head NSO and ask something in a polite way if you do think that there may have been a data entry error. I think it's tempting at times for skaters to look at the stats book and just think something along the lines of, well, this can't be right. This can't be calculating correctly. The formula must be wrong, or something like that. And this is really unlikely. The stats book was developed and has been utilized for many, many, many games over the years. So the formulas are correct. It's not calculating things incorrectly. It could just be, your memory kind of feeling quite different than what the numbers are telling you when you look at it. We did just look at that issue where sometimes things don't display correctly, so the wrong numbers are showing in the small cell that you're looking at, but you can resize the column in that case, or you can reduce the number of decimal points that are being shown in the cell and see the correct number that you're intending to see. Now, there was one story that I wanted to tell about this. Years ago, we went to a tournament, and we got great stats books after the fact from the head NSO of that tournament. And I think we were in communication with her for some other reason. I think I was the interleague coordinator that year, so I had been in touch with her to submit our rosters and things like that ahead of time. So when we got the stats books after the fact for our 3 games, I was looking through them and looking at the stats for our particular pack. We skated as a single pack throughout the entire tournament, so we could really look at our stats together as a pack. And there was one really memorable jam where our pivot had taken the star and had made a couple of scoring passes. It was a big jam for our pivot, and it was kind of a memorable experience. We all gave like a cheer after the jam, and it was the only time one of our pivots, took the star and scored in that way. So I was kind of looking for that on the stats. I was looking for those pivot points to show up for that particular skater in our pack, and they weren't showing up. Now, there were points attributed to that pivot, but they weren't showing up in the pivot, the pivot turn jammer plus minus. So I reached out to the head NSO just to ask about it. I kind of told her the story about remembering this particular jam. I told her that the points were appearing for this player, but they weren't appearing in that particular column. And it turned out that all the head NSO needed to do was add an asterisk to some cell somewhere, and I'm sure head NSOs know what I'm talking about, but an asterisk sometimes connotes a star pass situation for a jammer, and it'll move points into a particular other cell in the calculated stats book. So all she had to do was add an asterisk, and this IGRF was corrected and made right. So it can be helpful to reach out and ask. You just have to do it in a way that's kind of constructive and curious and kind, and move on from there. All right, so I think looking at a particular game, especially not the best game for you or for your team, is really not going to give you a sense of how you're doing as a player. You need to look at the trends, your trends individually and your trends as a team, because one game is not a trend. You have to look at multiple games over time. You know, players have a variety of performances in their games. Teams have a variety of different types of performances from game to game, so trends are where it's at. And when you do look at your stats and kind of note your trends, one thing that you really want to keep in mind is that you are looking for and really want to celebrate the wins that you see in your stats. I'm not talking about winning the game, I'm talking about the wins that you're seeing in particular stats that you care about. So if you are going through all this trouble to track your stats, to think about your stats, and you see something good and you just skip by it and look for the bad thing, you are really missing the point of tracking stats, because the whole point is to, you know, fine-tune your game, to make those improvements that are going to make you a more effective player. So if you don't take the moment to stop and acknowledge the success when a stat looks really good, I mean, that's a real bummer. You really want to take that time to acknowledge what's looking good for yourself and for your team, and to really celebrate that success. It's an important part of why we track stats. It's a lot easier to look at the next one, which is, you know, the opportunities, the stats that don't look as good. And this is really important to kind of frame in your mind as an opportunity to improve. It's really, really useful when you know exactly what you need to improve on. And that's what these opportunities are when you see them in the stats. You're getting specific information about how you can improve as a skater or as a team, and that's very valuable. And in terms of opportunities, again, one game isn't telling you the whole story. So what you want to do is look for things that have also been a problem in multiple previous games. So I really have a problem with multiplayer blocks, or I really have a problem with my VTAR being negative. And that's something that you can kind of work on putting some intention behind in your training and in your future games, and then track the progress on those particular stats. So as you're, you know, how do you functionally do this trend analysis over the course of a whole season, let's say? Well, the first thing is you need to ask for your stats books. If you're not already receiving them from your team captain or your interleague coordinator, make sure you're asking for them. It's required that they be turned in, so they do exist, and you can get them, especially if you're a skater and you're not already getting them. Usually when they're sent out to you from your team captain or something like that, they're going to be read-only, you know, for obvious reasons, because they need to be official documents sent to the WFTDA for sanctioning and whatnot. So if you do get a stats sheet, whether it's read-only or not, you really want to make your own copy. So use File, make a copy, add it to your own folder of stats, so that, you know, even if the file goes away from the original owner, you're still going to have your own copy. Something that I used to do to kind of help the stats make sense for me visually is I would resort the team, because of course, you know, the team stats come to you in jersey number order. But what I like to do is put all of our jammers together, put our packs together, put our less played players together into sections, and kind of look at those discrete, you know, groups of players who tend to play together, look at them together and assess them together. Another thing that I would sometimes do would be to remove those outliers that might be skewing the average on a stat. And I would really only do this as an extra data point, because when you do this, of course, they are not the official stats of the game anymore. So keep that in mind. But if you do have a big outlying stat that's skewing the average for everyone, and maybe it's a player who only skated in one or two jams in the game, you can remove that stat and get a different look at performance, you know, especially on those calculated VTAR stats for each individual skater. And then something that I did, which was really useful, was that I would create my own kind of bigger sheet that tracked particular stats that I cared about game over game. So every time I would get a new stats book, I would open up this other sheet that had, my number of penalties, my VTAR average plus minus, some other stats that I cared about as a player. And so I could compare my own stats game over game over the entire season. Jammers might have a different version of that, but this is how you kind of find those trends and look for those opportunities in your own game as a player. So which trend should I track? Which stat do I need to be looking at? Well, I think it's different for everyone, but I think really valuable for everyone to track their playtime, particularly as a percentage of the game, because again, this is something where the perception doesn't always match the reality, and the intention of the coaching staff doesn't always match the reality. So keeping track of that and having conversations about it with your coaching staff or with your players is really valuable. You also everyone wants to track the types of penalties they're getting, their total penalty count in the game, and their penalties per jam, because that's a stat that it really affects your own stats, your teammates' stats, and it gives a positive advantage to your opponents. So keep an eye on that game over game. And then your VTAR total plus minus and your VTAR average plus minus, kind of the holy grail of stats for personal effectiveness in a game, something that you definitely want to track over time. Jammers are going to want to track, their points per jam, their lead percentage, and their no initial trip. And blockers and pivots are going to want to be aware of how frequent star passes are happening. And, keep in mind that especially if you do play pivot, the pack columns are going to combine those blocker and pivot stats and kind of present your defensive effectiveness together, which is useful. So that is the end of this presentation on how to utilize WFTDA stats as a skater or as a coach. I appreciate you taking the time and watching this video. I hope something in here was useful for you. If you do have questions, or maybe you want to add some of your own insights on this topic, you can use the comment section below to discuss. And I hope you'll keep tracking those stats. See you next time.